I just did that so you guys would clap for me. I just had Thomas introduce me. Well, good evening. So it is a joy to welcome you to another installment of the Geneva Lecture Series. Just as a survey, raise your hand if you've been to a Geneva lecture before. Okay, so a lot of people have come back. That's a good sign. I like that. So if you are new to the lecture series, Geneva, since 1971, thanks to the work of Reverend Jason Chen, who is not with us tonight, but who many of you know, has had the privilege of hosting numerous guests who have engaged both hearts and minds with their faith and their work. So these guests include Alvin Plantinga, Cornel West, Marilyn Robinson, Richard Mao, Madeline Engel, Paul Schrader, Desmond Tutu, Brian Stevenson, David Brooks, and now Alan Noble. No pressure, Alan. That's a good list to be a part of. So if you would like to learn more about Geneva and our upcoming events, we encourage you to sign up for our newsletter. So I think there's a slide going up here in the sky that has a QR code that you can scan, or on many of the seats where you're sitting, there is a postcard that has also a QR code that you can sign up for our upcoming events. So I encourage you to do that. First, I want to thank just our sponsors, One Ancient Hope, Grace Community Church, and New Life Church for making tonight's event possible. So we can give them a round of applause just for making this happen tonight. And so tomorrow, there is a leadership event. Now, it's open to anybody, but there is a focus on the topic of leadership tomorrow at Grace Community Church in North Liberty. That's from 8:30 a.m. to 10, and it will include a light breakfast courtesy of Grace. I think there's an omelet station, prime rib. What else is there, Josh? Does that sound about right?
Hopes and dreams.
Hopes and dreams as well. Maybe some little powder white donuts, but it should be a good event, so we encourage you to check that out. It is also free. So, our guest, Alan Noble, as you may know, or you may not, is an author, professor, and what I would consider cultural exegete. So Alan's pulse on culture and his ability to articulate it in light of the gospel, in light of what it means to belong to Christ, is a rare gift. And I believe that we are all fortunate to have him share that gift with us tonight. So thank you, Alan. In his book, which he will be talking more on tonight, Getting Out of Bed, which unfortunately cannot be purchased here tonight. You don't have any extra copies? Yes, so you'll have to go to the internet to find some, or your local bookstore perhaps. But in his book on Getting Out of Bed, Alan writes this. He says, "We must see that each choice to do the next thing is an act of worship, and therefore fundamentally good. Feeding your pets is an act of worship. Brushing your teeth is. Doing the dishes, getting dressed, going to work. Insofar as each of these actions assumes that this life in this fallen world is good and worth living despite suffering, they are acts of faith in God. Choose to do the next thing before and unto God. Take a step toward the block. That is all you must ever do and all you can do. It is your spiritual act of worship." And so, perhaps you are here tonight needing to do the next thing. Perhaps being at this event is the next thing. Perhaps you being here will be the catalyst for the next thing your friend or family member does. Our hope is that in this act of being here, in this very moment and in this very place, listening to Alan's lecture, you will be able to worship and rejoice in the truth that you are more than your mind, your depression, your anxiety, your OCD, your emotions, your feelings, even your body. And remember that if you are in Christ, you are his workmanship, his prized possession, whom he has made radiant at the cost of his life. That's how much you are worth. That's how much God loves and adores you. He sings over you, his child, so you, in return, can sing, Jesus loves me. So, with that, let us worship together and welcome Dr. Alan Noble.
All right, I have Brett's notes here, so I'm just going to read off of those.
I left them there on purpose for
On
you to read.
purpose,
Yeah,
so if I run out of time, I run out of words, I can just riff off of those.
that's right.
All right, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. We are going to be wrestling with a serious topic, talking about serious things, life and death, but there are times to talk about serious things, and now is one of those times, as I hope to demonstrate to you this evening. Growing up, I knew a lot of people who lived painful, tragic lives, but I thought I was an anomaly. People close to me were molested, raped, beaten by parents, spouses, and close family friends. They were addicted to alcohol, meth, cocaine, and God knows what else. They went hungry and lived in filth. They were orphaned, abandoned, neglected, and imprisoned. They were willing to do almost anything to feel alive, even overdose. They lived hard lives where their daily experience was either acute suffering or prolonged numbness. And throughout all of this, I assumed that I was the anomaly. I assumed that outside of my circle of experience, I would discover that most people lived fairly pleasant lives, most adults at least. Not perfect lives, not without difficulties and accidents, but generally pleasant lives. Things like a good job, a fulfilling marriage, an exciting sex life, a photogenic family, a sense of accomplishment, a new phone, not too much debt, reasonably good health, very Christian, a pleasant life, a normal life. Now, I didn't believe that I was owed any of this. I understood that no one was guaranteed happiness in this life, but my sense of the world and of God was that if I put in my work and honored God with my life, then none of these good things were out of reach because they were normal. And as I grew up, there were very few signs that I was wrong about what the normal life looked like. Because when I met other adults, they mostly seemed pretty happy. They would greet me with warm smiles and conversations. They went to church. They took their kids to soccer. They had nice homes and nice cars and nice things. And the ones who did have hard lives, well, they tended to choose that suffering, or tended not to be Christian, or at least not good Christians. To my understanding, they were choosing that suffering, choosing to be miserable or depressed or whatever. And I would think to myself, if they just made better choices, if they were just a bit more disciplined, they wouldn't have to suffer like that. Now, you can walk around a long time thinking nonsense like this, thinking that most adults have it all together and live pleasant lives, and that the ones who don't have it all together probably only have themselves to blame. In fact, it's hard not to think like this even when you grow up around suffering, as I did. It's hard not to think like this because almost no one else today wants to tell you otherwise. We each try to hide our scars, even from those closest to us. And almost every cultural institution, be it church or government or corporation, promises you a good life if you just do what they ask. Make the right life choices. Marry the right person. Go to the right church. Get the right education. Work the right job. Buy the right products. It's a matter of choice to live a good life, outside of freak accidents, of course. And whatever challenges we face in life, we are promised can be solved. That is society's promise to us. Whatever you face in life, someone has developed a method for overcoming it. There's always a pill, there's always a treatment, a program, a devotional, a diet, an app, a candidate, which means that if you don't beat it, it's your own fault. You really should have tried harder. You really should have hustled harder. A normal life is a pleasant life, so I was led to believe. Well, I'm here to confess this evening that I was very wrong. I was not the anomaly, I was the norm. And I want you to understand what that means. Among young Americans, there has been a dramatic increase in mental health diagnoses. College campuses have been ground zero for these issues, but most schools have failed to keep up with the demand. Young people are torn up over broken families, child abuse, anxiety, depression, loneliness, dread that they'll never amount to anything, imposter syndrome, choice paralysis, porn addiction, suicidal ideation, death of parents. I'm talking profound and extensive brokenness. One survey found that nearly 43% of undergraduates felt so depressed that it was difficult to function in the past year. 43%. Functioning is pretty important if you're an undergraduate, if you're a human. So 43% that's pretty bad. 64% said they felt overwhelming anxiety. So 43% are depressed, 64% are anxious. Between scholarly research on the topic of the mental health crisis in college campuses and my own personal experience dealing in my office with college students coming to me with their problems, I've come to the assumption that in any given class that I teach, several students will be suffering from a diagnosed mental illness. Others will be survivors of sexual abuse, and many will struggle from depression, anxiety, and aimlessness. That's just a reality, a statistical reality that I've come to assume. While the rise in mental illness diagnoses can be partially explained by heightened awareness and decreased taboos, which is a good thing, that isn't the whole story. Something has changed. Our kids are not all right. And frankly, the rest of us aren't doing a whole lot better. According to the CDC, between 2011 and 2014, nearly 13% of persons aged 12 and over took antidepressant medication in the past month. The widespread use of psychiatric medication led one historian of psychiatry to remark, quote, I believe this quote is from the New York Times, "We've come to the place, at least in the West, where it seems every other person is depressed and on medication. You do have to wonder what that says about our culture." That is a fascinating claim from a historian of psychiatry. You do have to wonder what that says about our culture. At some point, you have to take a step back and say, without questioning any individual person's use of psychiatric medication. That is not what I'm doing here at all. But on a societal level, taking a step back and saying, when we look at the pattern of usage, maybe this is telling us that something is wrong. Something is not right here. More alarming is the trend of declining life expectancy in the United States. In November 2018, the CDC director released a statement that said that tragically, this troubling trend is largely driven by deaths from drug overdoses and suicides. So I don't know if you're aware of this, but up until last year, the trend leveled off, I think last year, maybe the year before, but we're not sure how long the leveling off will last. But up until last year, life expectancy in the United States had been declining. Now this is a historically strange thing, because in industrialized countries, life expectancy only goes one direction, and that is up. People live longer and longer. They don't live shorter amounts of time. And this started to happen before COVID. So this has nothing to do with COVID. People were living shorter amounts of time before COVID happened. And according to the CDC and the research, there are two economists, Ann Case and Angus Denton. They did research on this, fascinating research in a book called Deaths of Despair. And their finding was that the three primary reasons for this decline were deaths from suicide, alcoholism, and drug overdoses, which are all what they call deaths of despair. So it's not just younger people who are struggling with mental illness. These deaths of despair primarily hit male, middle-aged people without college education. A significant segment of the American population finds life unbearable. Interestingly, in their carefully researched study of declining life expectancy, these economists that I just mentioned repeatedly point to a loss of meaning experienced by less educated Americans who have experienced the loss of fulfilling work, marriages, churches, and communities as part of the cause of deaths of despair. I found that fascinating, a loss of meaning driving this. We are not only in a mental health crisis, in other words, we're in a meaning crisis. And those two things are related. A loss of meaning in the world leads for some people to a mental health crisis. These crises are connected. Here's some more alarming statistics. Suicide was the second leading cause of death among individuals between the ages of 10 and 14 and 25 and 34. The third leading cause of death between individuals ages 15 and 24, and the fifth leading cause of death among individuals ages 35 and 44. There are nearly twice as many suicides in the United States as there were homicides. So whatever you think about the current crime rates in America, I know that's right now we're in this political season where everyone's talking about crime rates and how terrible everything is. Whatever you feel about crime rates and homicides, your concern for suicide rates should be twice as great, because that's a much greater problem in our country today. Here's another alarming statistic that contributes to this problem. In 1990, among men, only 3% said that they had no close friends. That's a pretty low percentage, pretty acceptable percentage, I would say. Only 3% in 1990. By 2021, 15% said they had no close friends. Now, I teach literature, not math, but that's a 5 times increase in loneliness. Friends, as well as faith, one of the main supports when someone goes through a mental health crisis is community. In a culture without friends, who are we supposed to turn to when we go through suffering? How can we bear each other's burdens if we don't know each other? The U.S. Surgeon General issued a report in 2023 describing our loneliness epidemic and noting the profoundly negative effects it has on our health, an effect that is roughly equivalent to smoking cigarettes. Undoubtedly, this epidemic is contributing to our mental health crisis. But there's another popular explanation for the crisis. Recently, Jonathan Haidt has made the compelling argument in his book, The Anxious Generation, that the rise in mental illness among adolescents since 2010 has been caused by the explosion of social media and smartphones. And it's a pretty compelling argument. The data is pretty strong. According to Haidt, we have been too protective of our kids in the real world, overprotective, and not protective enough with them in the digital world. And as a result, they've become overwhelmed with images and messages and bullying and distractions that make them far less resilient in life's real struggles. But here's the thing, whatever the causes of our current mental health crisis, that it exists and that we must deal with it remains a pressing issue. Haidt says that Haidt argues for preventative measures like keeping teens off of social media, but we are left with the challenge of how to cope with the anxiety and depression that we already have. Certainly getting to the root of a mental health crisis is important, but in some ways these questions are academic and disconnected from our real-world experience. At the end of the day, each of us has to face ourselves and the challenge to live with anxiety and depression. Now, I have to say this, given these statistics that I've just mentioned and all these different causes that are contributing to the mental health crisis that we're dealing with, thankfully, in my own life, I've witnessed a massive change in how Christians talk about mental health. And for the most part, this has been a very good thing. Depression, anxiety, mental illness, therapy, psychiatrists, medication, all of these were treated with suspicion in churches I grew up in. Christians didn't use antidepressants, they just repented of sins. They didn't take anxiety medications, they learned to be anxious for nothing. And psychiatrists were viewed as godless false counselors. Unfortunately, this teaching is still alive in some parts of evangelicalism in America. Recently, a pastor named John MacArthur announced that ADHD, OCD, and PTSD are not real. He said that they are noble lies told by pharmaceutical companies to get us addicted to drugs that will eventually leave us destitute on Skid Row. And to that, I would say, if John MacArthur doubts the reality of OCD, I offer to allow him in my brain for a day, and then he can tell me what he thinks. Maybe I'm just attending better churches, but my sense of this is that most American Christians have moved on from this mindset. And in fact, the widespread reaction against John MacArthur after he said those things attests to this fact, that a lot of us have just moved on from that mindset. In fact, mental illness and mental health has lost so much of its stigma that it's not uncommon for people to post honest confessions about their anxiety, trauma, or specific disorders on social media. But for all this openness, I think for most people, mental suffering remains hidden. Sure, some people are talking about mental health quite loudly and openly in public, but the day-to-day experience of adult life has not changed that much. To quote Virgil, we each suffer our own ghosts, and I would add, we mostly suffer them alone. Here's the thing, get to know someone really well, I mean really well, and almost without fail, in my experience, you will discover a person who routinely struggles to get out of bed in the morning, and not just because they're tired. They can't get out of bed because once they step foot on the floor, they will be launched out into a day that is uncertain and lifeless and in some ways impossible. Or you will discover someone who suffers panic attacks every time there's another mass shooting, or someone who cannot stop obsessing over how they have failed as a Christian or a student or a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or someone who cannot stop eating or who cannot eat at all because they have misplaced guilt from being sexually assaulted. Or maybe someone who feels stuck in the habit of living even though they feel terribly alone and bored. Hear me, none of this is abnormal in our culture. None of this is an anomaly. This is what I discovered once I started to really get to know people around me. Some of this suffering is caused from living in an environment that I would argue is not designed for humans, which I talk about in my previous book, You Are Not Your Own, but some of this suffering is just part of being human. Most people will show no signs of the despair that follows them around, or at least those signs will be extremely subtle. They might surface in a vague prayer request. I need prayer for something I'm going through, they might say. Or they might appear in sudden moodiness, or tendencies toward distracting addictions like social media or pornography or video games. But mostly they are what I would call high-functioning adults. We may go through periods where our functioning breaks down and we stare blankly at our inbox, or we debate whether to get out of bed. But for the most part, we function. We get up, we go to work, we go to school, we buy things, we're entertained, we're stimulated, and then we go to sleep. But it's there, the depression, the anxiety, waiting for the right moment to reassert itself. Now, living in a society governed by technique makes us think life is easier than ever. Technique is the use of rational methods to maximize efficiency, and we see it everywhere. Scientifically proven methods for dating, studying, reading the Bible, budgeting, sleeping, and losing weight. I mentioned this example in my second book, You Are Not Your Own, but I like to sleep on my side, and I'm still having this problem actually. I'm having pain in my neck sleeping on my side, and so what do you do when you have a problem in life now?
Google it.
You Google it. And so I went to Google and I asked, how to sleep on your side. And sure enough, there was a most efficient way to sleep on your side, because there is a most efficient way to do everything in life. Someone has found the most efficient way to do everything in life. And if you're not doing it the most efficient way, you're falling behind in some way. The promise of technique is that we are collectively overcoming all of the challenges in life, including side sleeping, through research, technology, and discipline. All you have to do is find the right self-help book, life hack, app, or Bible study. And this is exactly why techniques promise that life is easier than ever becomes just another source of dread and shame. If life doesn't have to be this hard, if there are answers to my problems, then it's really my fault that I'm overwhelmed or a failure. I should have known better. I should have worked harder. I should have done more to fix my problem. But what if contemporary society isn't built for us, for humans as God designed us? If that's the case, then sometimes anxiety and depression will be rational and natural responses to a fundamentally disordered society. The title of Alan Einrenberg's book, which is a wonderful book called The Weariness of the Self, it's a history of depression, reflects this diagnosis. He argues that we are weary of trying to be our own sovereign selves. He says we have radical freedom to remake our identities, but it has come at a great cost. Quote, if moral constraints have grown lighter, psychic constraints have taken their place. Emancipation and action have stretched individual responsibility beyond all borders and made us painfully aware that we are only ourselves. Elsewhere, he refers to this as the illness of responsibility. In other words, as external moral authorities have gone away, we're free to do whatever we want, be whoever we want to be, feel however we feel, become whoever we want to be. We're left with our own inner sense of morality. And that responsibility to be autonomous gives us new psychological stressors. Or put differently, belonging to ourselves is killing ourselves. Inadequacy and inaction are the defining features of contemporary depression in Einrenberg's research. Regardless of the causes, contemporary life is marked by widespread psychological and spiritual despair and the sense that answers are available, particularly through proper mental health. There is a danger, I think, in relying too heavily on the language of mental health. Now, I'm not going to argue that psychiatry and psychology are godless fields and that you just need to pray harder. Sorry, John MacArthur. There is a great value in both fields, and I have personally benefited from both of them. And this is the place where I share my personal story to establish my credibility, but I'm not going to do that. Because I don't want to. I just want you to understand that I am not opposed to therapy or psychiatric medication. In fact, I think that if you are struggling, you should pursue professional help. As I said and continue to say, they're highly valuable. But I do have a fear. My fear is that sometimes medical language obscures or replaces the very thing it is supposed to be treating. Sometimes getting a diagnosis puts your mental suffering in a nice, tidy little box. It objectifies it in a way that grants it a life of its own. The unknown is so much more frightening than the known, so it can become a great relief to get a diagnosis. If there is a diagnosis, there must be a treatment. And with a diagnosis, we can objectify our suffering. We can set it on the table and examine it and communicate it to others. I am not depressed, I have depression. It is over there and I am over here. I can contain my illness because I can name it. My experience has a listing in the DSM-5, so maybe it's curable after all. If you have ever been to counseling long-term or been medically treated for a disorder, you know that such simple, concrete answers are few and far between. Because the mind is wonderfully made. The best mental health professionals are not scientists who offer precise, scientifically objective diagnoses with perfectly targeted solutions, but in my opinion, perpetual students of the human heart and soul who guide you through care. They do not provide you categorical and rational explanations for your suffering, but intuit with wisdom and compassion. They offer a sympathetic ear and wise advice, but rarely, although sometimes, but rarely ever anything approaching a cure. In psychiatry, psychiatrists can sometimes provide medication that helps lessen your suffering, but disturbingly, we don't always know how or why antidepressants work. We know that antidepressants are helpful to some people sometimes, which is good, but we don't know exactly why they work. And frankly, some drugs for some people seem to have a higher likelihood of producing terrible side effects than doing the one thing they were supposed to do. You had one job, make me less depressed, and somehow all you've managed to do is make me groggy. It's an unfortunate reality. Now, when you realize this, in the process of seeking professional help, it's not hard to fall back into despair, to feel alone and helpless. Normal people go on living their pleasant lives, and here you are, stuck to the wall with a pin. Let me be very clear. If you are suffering, please seek professional help, because despite these challenges, we have great resources available to us today. We just have to take initiative and advocate for ourselves. But remember two facts. First, life is hard. And during some periods, it is all but unbearably hard. Life can be so difficult and painful and boring that you cannot comprehend the experience right now unless you are in the midst of it. Even if you have experienced these seasons in the past, you almost certainly cannot remember them accurately right now. You might be able to remember the dates when you were unable to show up at work because of depression, but that experience of depression remains inaccessible to you unless it returns in force. We get separated from our suffering by time. For all of human history, we have known this truth. Human existence is inescapably tragic. But it's hard to recall this truth when we are surrounded by forces that promise us greater and greater ease and comfort through techniques. So remember, tremendous suffering is a normal part of being in this world, not an anomaly. Beauty and love and joy are normal too, but also suffering. Second, there are rarely clear, definitive answers to depression, anxiety, and other disorders. You can and should pursue professional help, but just remember that there are limits. Your therapy session will come to an end. Your medication will help you, and then it'll stop. And in those limits, you're thrown back on yourself, on God, and your neighbor for the task of living, and it is a task. All the counseling and medication in the world cannot replace the existential decision to live and rely on God and your neighbor. Professional help can guide you and medication can assist you, but in the end, it's always you, God, and your neighbor and the present choice to act, which at root is actually the choice to worship. And that is okay. Really, it is. It's even beautiful. Which brings me to the point of all this. What does it mean to live? We quite rightly hear regular appeals for people who are struggling with suicidal ideation to get help. But there remains the question of what it means to live. Why is it meaningful and good to live? What's the point of all this? This question might sound morbid, but it's a foundational question to life itself. Hamlet had to answer it, and you'll have to answer it. If you don't have an answer to it now, when the time comes, there will be no time. You need to know that your being in the world is a witness. It testifies. There is no avoiding this fact. All we can do is decide what your existence is a witness to and how you can share the burden of witnessing. Life will inevitably crush you at one point or another. It's normal. And your response to that suffering will testify to something. There will be times when you will be convinced that life is not worth living and that existence is burdensome and meaningless, even as a Christian. No one wants to tell you this, especially in the church, but it's true. When those times come, your duty is to acknowledge the objective truth that life is good and that despite our distress, we must get up and carry on. Your existence is a testament, a living argument, an affirmation of creation itself. When you rise out of bed each day, that act is a faint but real echo of God's "it is good." You are declaring that God's creation, you, has meaning and value. You are declaring that to the world, but also to yourself. By choosing to act, you retrain your brain to see the goodness of being, even when your heart denies that goodness. Rising out of bed is also a decisive act. You see, living is a gamble. We know this. It's a severe gamble. You don't know the suffering and sorrow that awaits you. You don't know the heartache. But you do know that it is coming for you, eventually. Of that, history and literature have testified without counterclaim. To choose to go on is to proclaim with your life, and at the risk of tremendous suffering, that life is good. Even when it is hard, it is good. Life is an awesome responsibility and a burden. Like it or not, if you give up on life, it will open up the possibility for others to give up. You have the solemn responsibility to bear witness to the goodness of life by living despite suffering, despite the fact that the pleasant life isn't actually all that normal. But, hear me, life is also a gift. And as it turns out, the greatest gifts are also burdens. Love, children, wisdom, beauty, salvation. Our being is the result of the gratuitous love of God, and we honor that gift by participating fully in it, even when participating in life feels unbearable. None of this is to imply that suicidal ideation and depression are trivial matters that we can just pray away or will to disappear. But it does mean that for Christians who understand that existence is an essential act of God's love for us, suicide is not an imaginable option. It's just not. We can admit that we and many others have struggled with and will continue to struggle with suicidal ideation. Some thorns, I'm afraid, won't come out of the flesh this side of paradise. But part of facing despair is knowing how we can respond. And if our life is a witness to the goodness of creation and therefore the goodness of the Creator, ending your life can never be a real possibility, no matter how strongly you feel dread or alienation or fear. We have an obligation to live according to the truth that this life is actually a miraculous gift. Now, I understand that what I'm speaking about is painful and difficult, and yet this is our calling, to glorify God by honoring His creation, which is you. And in doing so, you honor your neighbor's existence. when you cannot believe that your existence is a sacred gift from God, when you can no longer even believe in the objective goodness of other people's lives, then you must surrender to the grace of your neighbors, particularly in the church. You must learn to accept their wise love for you, their words of assurance, which may not heal you, but can carry you when you are incapable of carrying yourself. Sometimes your duty in life is to simply trust and rely on the love of others. Let them bear you up. Ultimately, the only reason to keep living is if you live unto God. If His word is true, then we are divinely created to glorify Him and enjoy Him forever. And our creation was fundamentally a good act. The only other reasons to live are for the world, the flesh, or the devil, and they only want you to live as long as you are useful to them. Once you stop being productive and your credit dries up so that you can no longer buy stuff, the world doesn't care if you're alive. Once your body primarily experiences pain rather than pleasure, your flesh has no reason to stay alive. You're no longer useful to your flesh. Usefulness is the sole criterion for the world, the flesh, and the devil. But you have no use value to God. You can't. There's nothing He needs. You can't be useful to God because you were never useful to begin with. That's not why He created you and why He continues to sustain you and your being in the world. It was gratuitous. He made you just because He loves you, just for His own good pleasure. Every other reason to live demands that you remain useful, and one day your use will run out. One day you won't be good enough, or beautiful enough, or successful enough to be useful, and that will be it. But not so with God. To God, your existence in His universe is an act of creation, and it remains good as creation, even in its fallen state. We all suffer silent crises, carrying burdens that are utterly invisible to those closest to us, occasionally even opaque to ourselves, but it is good. Even when we can't feel it, life remains good. While suffering is a normal part of human life, hear this, it is not the essence. At the center of existence is not suffering, but grace, the grace of Christ, the grace that cleanses you from all unrighteousness and provides food and beauty and created you. The same God who sent His Son to die for you sustains your existence and created you, miraculous you, because He loves you, whether you feel it or not. We will forget this fact many times throughout our lives. The task before us is to hold each other up, to remind ourselves of the truth that is truer than our deepest misery, to attend to the gift that God has given us, to accept that it is good even when we do not feel that goodness at all. And the exciting thing is, when we choose to act faithfully to God's gift of life by embracing it, you make it more plausible and tangible for others. All of us act based on the models of living that we have before us. You have the opportunity to model resilience for others around you. People you don't even know are watching to see how you will respond to adversity. And it's a blessing that we have to demonstrate God's goodness and love by pursuing life, which doesn't mean that the clouds go away, but it does mean that there is meaning and purpose in your suffering. Despite the comforts of contemporary life and its promises of ever greater peace, life is terribly hard and pleasant isn't always normal. And even while we might hesitate to call getting out of bed courageous, it seems undeniably true to me that day-to-day life demands a great deal of courage. That courage speaks loudly. It confesses the nature of creation and of God. It is our burden and our gift. It is our spiritual act of worship, presenting our bodies as a living sacrifice. And when you cannot get up, let someone carry you, knowing that in due time you will be called upon to do the same. Christ's body here on earth is one of His mercies to us, and it is the only way we make it through. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you for your presentation and your insights. One of the things you mentioned was a loss of meaning.
Yeah.
So in the 15th book of John, chapter, I believe it's verse 13, Jesus talks about laying down our lives for the good of others. So what are your thoughts, and how do you propose to bring more meaning into people's lives?
Good question.
It'd be a bummer if I ask a bad question.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's an important question. How do we bring more meaning into people's lives? Well, the challenging thing about this is meaning occurs, I would say, I believe that meaning primarily occurs through moments of what I would call, well, not what I call, what a philosopher named Hartmut Rosa calls resonance, where you encounter something in the world and it's something that you can't control and you resonate with it. So let me give you an example. When you hear a song, it's a really good song, and it's a rich song. It's not a pop song that you listen to 10 times and you're like, I get that song, I don't need to listen to it ever again. It's a rich song. You listen to that song and it resonates within you and you respond to that song. And you move, maybe you move to the song, maybe you start thinking about what the lyrics mean to you, you respond to that song in some way. But there's depth to the song, and so you keep listening to it over and over. You can't quite capture the song. It's uncontrollable in a sense. That's a feeling of an experience of what Hartmut Rosa calls resonance. You resonate with that song. Another way of putting it, I would say, is that's a meaningful experience. And when you have those experiences with music, we all, or most of us have had those experiences with music, that's when we like music, right? When you've had that experience with a song, you're like, this is my favorite song. All of our favorite songs are songs that resonate with us, all right? Same thing with music or poetry or novels or films. You have the same experience with people. The difficulty is that our society tends to, what Rosa says is, it tends to make things controllable. It tries to capture things and make things controllable. So instead of having face-to-face conversations where almost anything can happen and you're uncontrollable and I can resonate with you, we have conversations on this device, right? Where things are captured and flat. And that's a long way of answering your question to say that there are a lot of societal changes that would need to take place for meaning to be revised. I do think that churches can be places where I do think churches can be meaningful places in a culture that has thin meaning. Not all churches do this, but I think, in fact, some churches lean into the thin meaning and to the technology and become just as vapid as the rest of the culture. But there is a richness to church tradition that leans into meaning, and I think that that's possible. But yeah, that's what I would say. That's a hard nut to crack. Yeah.
Could I
You
go
want to follow
one
up?
step more?
Yeah.
So what would you say to servanthood and volunteerism and interaction with others in a meaningful way? I would suggest that that's one of the best ways to bring people out of a sense of loneliness, loss of meaning, and so forth. So your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Look, so anything where you are bringing people out of themselves and into contact with the world and with other people I think you're going to have opportunities for them to engage with other people. And we know as Christians that servant service is one of the highest forms of engagement that we can do, right? So I think that would be a great way of creating meaningful, existence. The thing is, it's not going to be enough, right? So if you were to, let's say, hypothetically have service days at your church, but then the people who do those service days go back to a meaningless job, they're still going to struggle with meaninglessness. And that's part of our problem. And I think that's part of what I was trying to touch on, is that it's a societal problem. And so a lot of our jobs lack substance and meaningfulness and purpose, and that causes a lot of problems as well. We need to go to another question here. Yeah.
Yeah, so I know obviously the first two answers are share Jesus